Do you believe that your entire life could be nothing more than a dream? What if we told you right now that there are real documented cases of people who woke up from comas absolutely certain they had lived entire lifetimes while unconscious? And we're not talking about fuzzy dreams or vague memories. We're talking about years, sometimes decades, complete with marriages, children, careers, and aging. And if you think that consciousness only exists in movies and that there always has to be a logical explanation for everything, then we're really curious to hear how you're going to explain these 10 mysterious cases. So, let's jump straight into the first case, and this one is truly intense. Number 10. The man who lived an entire decade in 15 minutes. This case you're about to hear became one of the most viral stories on the internet, and to this day, thousands of people still debate whether it actually happened. Imagine you're walking through your home on a regular Tuesday evening. You have a wife you've been married to for 7 years. You have 2 children, a daughter who just started kindergarten, and a son who's learning to ride a bike. You have a job, a mortgage, friends who come over for barbecues on the weekend. And then, suddenly, in one terrifying instant, all of it disappears. Not because you died, but because you woke up. In 2012, a man posted his story on Reddit under the username Temporal, and what he described sent shockwaves through the internet. He explained that years earlier, he had been at a college football game when a fight broke out in the stands. Someone threw a punch, and the man was knocked unconscious. He collapsed onto the concrete steps and lay there motionless while paramedics rushed to help him. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. While his body was lying on those steps, his mind went somewhere else entirely. According to his account, he woke up in a hospital room with a foggy memory of what had happened. But the doctors told him he was fine and discharged him the next day. He went back to his normal life, finished college, got a job, and started dating a woman he met at a party. They fell in love. They got married. They bought a house with a red door and a small backyard. And then they had 2 children. His daughter was born first. He described watching her take her first steps, hearing her first words, holding her hand as she walked into her first day of school. His son came 3 years later, a wild little boy who loved dinosaurs and insisted on wearing superhero capes to the grocery store. He described years of birthday parties, family vacations, arguments with his wife that they always resolved before bed, and the slow, comfortable rhythm of a life being lived. 10 years passed, and then, one evening, while sitting in his living room, something strange happened. He was watching television when his gaze drifted to a lamp sitting on the table beside the couch. There was something wrong with it. The lamp looked off somehow. The angles didn't make sense. The proportions were distorted. He couldn't stop staring at it. And the more he stared, the more reality around him began to ripple and tear. And then he woke up. He was lying on the concrete steps at the football stadium, surrounded by paramedics and concerned faces. According to everyone around him, only about 15 minutes had passed since he was knocked unconscious. But for him, an entire decade had vanished. His wife, his daughter, his son, his home with the red door, the slow, beautiful life he had built for 10 years. None of it was real. When doctors examined his brain scans later, they found nothing unusual. No damage, no abnormalities, nothing that could explain what had happened to him. Medical professionals were baffled. Some suggested he had experienced a form of hyper-realistic dreaming, caused by the trauma to his head, but others weren't so sure because the level of detail and emotional coherence he described was unlike anything typically seen in dreams. The man later wrote that he mourned his wife and children for years. He described falling into a deep depression because he couldn't understand how love that felt so real could simply not exist. His daughter's laugh, his son's smile, the way his wife would hum in the kitchen while making breakfast, all of it haunted him because it felt more real than his actual waking life. Some researchers who study consciousness believe this case points to something extraordinary about the human brain. They suggest that under extreme conditions, the brain might be capable of generating entirely self-contained realities, complete with characters, timelines, and emotional depth that rival our waking experiences. If that's true, then the boundary between what's real and what's imagined becomes terrifyingly thin. Was this man's entire family just a fabrication of neurons firing in his unconscious brain? Or did his consciousness somehow travel to another timeline, another version of reality, and live there until something pulled him back? The man later said in the follow-up posts that the hardest part wasn't the loss itself. It was the loneliness of that loss. No one around him understood. His friends thought he was crazy. His family thought he needed medication. But to him, the grief was as real as if his wife and children had died in a car accident. The only difference was that no one believed they had ever existed at all. He described moments where he would see something, a certain type of lamp, a red door on a house, a child the same age his daughter would have been, and the memories would come flooding back. Not like dreams that fade upon waking, like actual memories that felt more vivid than anything from his real life. And here's the question that still haunts anyone who reads this story. If our brains can create entire lifetimes in a matter of minutes, how do we know that this reality isn't someone else's coma dream? Subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It's completely free and helps us continue creating these exciting videos. Thank you so much. Number 9. The woman who aged 40 years in 3 days. This case comes from a hospital in London and was documented by a team of neurologists studying consciousness disorders in coma patients. And what they found challenges everything we think we know about time and perception. In 2018, a 34-year-old woman named Sarah Mitchell was rushed to the emergency room after a severe car accident on the M25 motorway. Her injuries were catastrophic: multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and significant head trauma. Doctors performed emergency surgery and managed to stabilize her, but she slipped into a coma that would last for nearly 3 days. When Sarah finally woke up on the 3rd day, the medical staff noticed something immediately strange. She was confused, disoriented, and kept asking where her grandchildren were. The nurses assumed it was typical post-coma confusion. But then Sarah looked at her hands and screamed. She demanded a mirror. When they finally gave her one, she stared at her own reflection in complete shock and began sobbing uncontrollably. According to Sarah, she wasn't 34 years old. She was 74, and she had lived those 40 years in vivid, unbroken detail while her body lay unconscious in that hospital bed. Sarah described everything. She remembered turning 40 and celebrating with her husband at a restaurant in Paris. She remembered her children graduating from university and starting families of their own. She recalled the death of her mother and the grief that followed. She described retiring from her career as a teacher at age 65 and moving to a cottage in the countryside with a garden full of roses. She remembered holding her first grandchild, a little boy named Oliver, who loved to build towers out of wooden blocks. And she remembered growing old. She described the aches that came with aging, the way her eyesight slowly faded, the diagnosis of arthritis that made it harder to tend her garden. She remembered her 70th birthday party, surrounded by 3 generations of family, feeling grateful for the life she had lived. But when Sarah woke up, she was back in her 34-year-old body, in a hospital room, with none of those memories existing in the real world. Her husband was at her bedside, but in her mind, she had already watched him grow old beside her for 4 decades. Her children hadn't been born yet. Her mother was still alive. The cottage didn't exist. Oliver didn't exist. The neurologists who documented Sarah's case were stunned. They ran every test available, looking for explanations in her brain activity during the coma. What they found was unusual. During certain periods of her unconsciousness, her brain had shown intense activity in the regions associated with memory formation and narrative processing, almost as if her brain was actively constructing a continuous storyline. Dr. Marcus Webb, the lead neurologist on Sarah's case, later published a paper suggesting that extreme trauma might trigger a protective mechanism in the brain. Instead of shutting down completely, the brain might generate an elaborate internal reality as a way of processing fear, pain, or the possibility of death. But what he couldn't explain was why Sarah's experience felt so continuous, so logical, and so emotionally coherent across decades of perceived time. Sarah spent months in therapy trying to reconcile her 2 lives. She described feeling like a stranger in her own body, a 74-year-old woman trapped in the flesh of someone who hadn't lived yet. She grieved for the grandchildren she would never hold. She struggled to connect with her actual husband because in her mind, she had already spent an entire lifetime with him. Some researchers point to Sarah's case as evidence that consciousness might not be tightly bound to the physical brain. If she could experience 40 years in 3 days, what does that say about the nature of time itself? Is time merely a construct, something our brains interpret rather than an external force? And if Sarah truly lived those 40 years, even if only in her mind, were those years any less real than the ones she'll live now? But that was still just the beginning. The next case is even more disturbing. Number 8. The teenager who lived 3 separate lives. In 2015, a 17-year-old from Brisbane, Australia named Marcus Young was swimming at a local beach when he was caught in a powerful rip current. Lifeguards reached him after he had been underwater for nearly 4 minutes. By the time they pulled him to shore, he had no pulse. Emergency responders performed CPR for over 6 minutes before his heart finally restarted. He was rushed to the hospital and placed in a medically induced coma to reduce brain swelling. Marcus remained unconscious for 11 days. When he finally woke up, his parents were overjoyed. But Marcus looked at them with the strangest expression, almost like he was studying their faces, trying to remember who they were. And then he said something that made everyone in the room go completely silent. He asked which life this was. Over the following weeks, as Marcus recovered physically, he began to describe what he had experienced during those 11 days. But unlike other cases, Marcus didn't just live one alternate life while unconscious. He lived 3. The first life began moments after he went under the water. In that reality, he was never rescued. He drowned at 17, and his consciousness somehow persisted. He described watching his own funeral from somewhere outside his body. He saw his parents crying, his friends leaving flowers on a grave, and then everything faded to black, and he found himself somewhere else entirely. In his second life, Marcus woke up as a completely different person. He was a middle-aged man named David, living in Manchester, England, in what felt like the 1980s. He had a wife named Christine and 2 daughters. He worked in a factory that manufactured car parts. He described the smell of oil and metal, the rhythm of the machines, the way his back would ache after long shifts. He lived as David for what felt like 23 years before dying of a heart attack at the age of 61. And then he woke up again, this time in his third life. In this reality, Marcus was someone else entirely, a woman named Priya, living in Mumbai, India. He described learning to adjust to a female body, to a different culture, to a family that spoke a language he somehow understood perfectly. He lived as Priya for over 30 years, marrying, having children, and eventually becoming a grandmother before dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. After Priya's death, Marcus felt himself falling through darkness, and then suddenly, he was back in the hospital in Brisbane, staring at his parents' faces and trying to understand which reality was actually real. The psychiatrists who evaluated Marcus initially suspected confabulation, a condition where the brain creates false memories to fill gaps in consciousness. But Marcus's descriptions were far too detailed, too internally consistent, and too emotionally affecting to fit typical patterns of confabulation. He could describe streets in Manchester and neighborhoods in Mumbai that he had never visited. He could recall specific historical events from the 1980s that had happened before he was born. Some researchers who studied Marcus's case quietly suggested that his experiences might be evidence of something science isn't ready to explain. What if consciousness isn't localized to a single brain, a single body, a single life? What if during near-death states, consciousness can slip between different timelines, different identities, different realities altogether? Marcus struggled for years to adjust to being himself again. He described feeling like he had the memories of 4 different people living inside his head. He mourned 3 families, 3 identities, 3 entire lifetimes that no one else believed were real. To this day, he still occasionally wakes up in the middle of the night, confused about which life he's supposed to be living. And now it gets even stranger. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. If you could live an entire lifetime in a dream, would you want to remember it when you woke up? Just write your answer in the comments below. We're excited to see what everyone picks. Number 7. The firefighter who returned speaking a dead language. This case has baffled linguists and neurologists alike for over a decade, and it remains one of the most mysterious coma recoveries ever documented. In 2007, a firefighter named Thomas Reed from Glasgow, Scotland, was responding to a warehouse fire when the structure partially collapsed. A falling beam struck him on the head, and he was buried under debris for nearly 2 hours before rescue teams could reach him. He was airlifted to a hospital in critical condition with severe traumatic brain injury and remained in a coma for 6 weeks. When Thomas finally regained consciousness, the medical staff immediately noticed something was wrong. He opened his eyes, looked around the room, and began speaking. But the words that came out of his mouth weren't English. They weren't Scottish Gaelic either. They weren't any language that anyone in the hospital recognized. Thomas spoke continuously for nearly 20 minutes in this unknown language before finally falling silent and asking, in English, where he was. When doctors asked him what language he had been speaking, he looked confused. He didn't remember saying anything. Over the following days, Thomas began experiencing what he described as memory intrusions. He would suddenly recall events that hadn't happened to him, conversations in languages he had never learned, faces of people he had never met. And occasionally, especially when he was tired or stressed, he would slip back into speaking that strange, unknown language. Linguists were brought in to analyze recordings of Thomas's speech. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the academic community. The language Thomas was speaking bore striking similarities to an ancient Celtic dialect that had been extinct for over 1,000 years. It contained grammatical structures and vocabulary that matched fragmentary inscriptions found on stones in remote parts of Scotland and Ireland, inscriptions that modern scholars could only partially translate. Thomas had never studied linguistics or ancient languages. He had barely finished secondary school before joining the fire service at 18. There was no logical explanation for how he could speak a language that hadn't been used by anyone alive for centuries. When psychiatrists finally managed to piece together what Thomas experienced during his coma, the story that emerged was extraordinary. Thomas described living an entire life in ancient Scotland, sometime around the 8th century. He was a warrior in a clan that lived in the Highlands, and he remembered battles, rituals, the faces of his wife and children, and the cold stone walls of the dwelling where he slept. He described dying in combat, feeling a spear pierce his chest, and then waking up in the Glasgow hospital over 1,000 years later. Some researchers dismissed Thomas's experience as an elaborate confabulation, arguing that his damaged brain had somehow constructed a fantasy from fragments of Celtic imagery he might have absorbed unconsciously throughout his life. But others weren't convinced. The linguistic accuracy was too precise. The cultural details were too specific. A small group of consciousness researchers who interviewed Thomas years later suggested an alternative theory. They proposed that Thomas's near-death experience might have temporarily disconnected his consciousness from his present brain, allowing it to access what some call the collective unconscious, a theoretical reservoir of all human experience across time. If consciousness isn't generated by the brain but merely received by it, like a radio tuning into a signal, then perhaps Thomas's damaged brain accidentally tuned into a different frequency, picking up the memories of someone who had lived and died over 1,000 years ago. Thomas eventually learned to control the intrusions through meditation and therapy, but he still dreams in that ancient language sometimes, and he swears that when he does, he feels more at home than he ever does in the waking world. What makes Thomas's case so compelling is that he had no interest in history before his accident. His colleagues at the fire station described him as a practical man who cared about football scores and car engines, not ancient civilizations or mystical experiences. The transformation in his personality after the coma was so dramatic that some of his oldest friends struggled to recognize him. He started reading voraciously about Celtic history, not to learn, he said, but to confirm what he already remembered. And again, the books matched his memories in ways that couldn't be explained. by coincidence. Number 6. The child who remembered dying in the future. This case comes from Japan and was documented by pediatric neurologists at Tokyo University Hospital. And what makes it so disturbing is that the patient wasn't remembering a past life. He was remembering a future one. In 2019, an 8-year-old boy named Hiroshi Tanaka was hospitalized after falling from a playground structure and hitting his head on concrete. He lost consciousness immediately and was rushed to the emergency room, where doctors discovered a subdural hematoma, bleeding between his brain and skull. They performed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure, but Hiroshi slipped into a coma that lasted for 19 days. When Hiroshi finally woke up, he seemed normal at first. He recognized his parents, remembered his name, and could answer basic questions. But within hours, he began describing memories that made everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. Hiroshi said he had lived to be very old. He described being an adult, having a career as an engineer, and getting married to a woman named Yuki, whom he described in vivid detail, including a small scar on her left cheek and the way she laughed. He described raising 2 daughters and watching them grow up. He described retiring to a house near the coast and spending his final years gardening and watching the ocean. But here's where the case becomes truly unsettling. Hiroshi also described the world of the future with uncanny specificity. He talked about massive floating screens that people used to communicate, about cars that drove themselves, and about cities where buildings were covered in plants that cleaned the air. He described a pandemic that had happened when he was in his 20s, one that had killed millions of people worldwide. Remember, this was 2019. The COVID-19 pandemic wouldn't begin for another year. When the coronavirus outbreak occurred in early 2020, Hiroshi's parents were terrified. Their son had described something eerily similar to what was happening around them. They reached out to the doctors who had treated Hiroshi, sharing his recorded statements from months earlier. The medical team was stunned. Hiroshi had described a global respiratory illness, overflowing hospitals, and people wearing masks everywhere they went, all before anyone outside of Wuhan had ever heard of COVID-19. Neurologists struggled to explain Hiroshi's case. Some suggested coincidence, arguing that a child's imagination, combined with fragments of science fiction he might have consumed, could have produced something that happened to align with future events. But others found that explanation deeply unsatisfying given the level of detail Hiroshi had provided. Dr. Kenji Matsumoto, the pediatric neurologist who documented Hiroshi's case, later wrote a paper exploring the possibility that consciousness during coma states might not be constrained by linear time. He referenced theories in quantum physics that suggest time might be more fluid than we experience it, and that under certain conditions, human awareness might be able to perceive events that haven't happened yet. Hiroshi is now a teenager. He still occasionally has what he calls memory flashes of his other life, the one he lived as an old man in a future that hasn't arrived yet. He describes it like watching clips from a movie he's already seen but can't quite remember. His parents have kept detailed journals of everything Hiroshi predicts, waiting to see what else might come true. Some of his predictions have been mundane and unverifiable. Others have been oddly specific and haven't happened yet. But the pandemic prediction shook everyone who knew about his case, and researchers continue to monitor his statements closely. And he's already identified the woman he believes will become his wife. a girl in his class named Yuki. She has a small scar on her left cheek. Number 5. The soldier who lived through both world wars in a single night. This case comes from declassified military medical records and represents one of the most extensively documented coma experiences in modern history. In 1991, during the Gulf War, an American soldier named Sergeant Michael Davis was seriously wounded when his convoy struck an improvised explosive device in the Iraqi desert. The blast killed 3 of his fellow soldiers and left Davis with severe shrapnel wounds and traumatic brain injury. He was evacuated to a military hospital in Germany, where doctors placed him in a medically induced coma to give his brain time to heal. Davis remained unconscious for 8 days. When he woke up, his first words were, "Did we win?" Medical staff assumed he was asking about the Gulf War, but as they spoke with him, they quickly realized he wasn't talking about Iraq at all. He was asking about the Battle of the Somme. Davis described waking up in a muddy trench somewhere in France, surrounded by soldiers in uniforms he didn't recognize. The year, he was told, was 1916. He was no longer Sergeant Michael Davis. He was a British private named William Ellis, fighting in one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. Davis described living as William for what felt like 2 years. He experienced the horror of trench warfare, the constant shelling, the bodies of friends rotting in no man's land. He was wounded twice and survived. He described the armistice in 1918, the relief of going home and trying to build a normal life in a country scarred by war. But then time jumped. Suddenly, Davis found himself in 1940. Another war had begun. He was still William Ellis, now middle-aged, watching Nazi bombers fly over London during the Blitz. He described rushing his wife and children into an underground shelter while explosions shook the city above. He lived through 6 more years of war, watching his oldest son enlist and never return. William Ellis died in 1952, peacefully in his sleep, an old man surrounded by grandchildren. And then Davis woke up in the military hospital in Germany, 29 years old again, with the memories of an entire life, spanning 2 world wars, living inside his head. The military psychiatrists who evaluated Davis were deeply troubled by his case. His descriptions of World War I trench conditions matched historical records with startling accuracy, including details about specific battles and troop movements that he had no way of knowing. He described the layout of a small village in France that had been destroyed in 1917 and never rebuilt, a village that appeared in no modern maps but was later confirmed through archival research. Davis was honorably discharged from the military and spent years working with historians to document what he remembered. Many of his memories were eventually verified through historical records, though some details couldn't be confirmed either way. Researchers who studied Davis's case proposed that his consciousness might have somehow merged with that of a real person from the past, a man named William Ellis, who might have actually existed. If consciousness can persist beyond death, and if coma states create openings between different periods of time, then perhaps Davis briefly became the vessel for memories that belonged to someone else entirely. Davis died in 2017 at the age of 55 from complications related to his Gulf War injuries. In his final interview, he said he wasn't afraid of death because he had already died once before, in 1952, and it had been peaceful. Number 4. The artist who woke up with a stranger's memories. This case is one of the most documented in medical literature. and has been studied by neuroscientists around the world because of its implications for how we understand memory and identity. In 2003, a 42-year-old artist named Elena Russo was living in Florence, Italy, when she collapsed in her studio and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors discovered she had suffered a severe aneurysm that had caused massive bleeding in her brain. She underwent emergency surgery and was placed in a coma for 23 days while her brain healed. When Elena woke up, she couldn't remember her own name. She couldn't recognize her husband or children. She didn't know she was an artist or that she had lived in Florence for over 20 years. Her autobiographical memory was completely gone, but she remembered everything about someone else. Elena immediately began asking for people no one had heard of. She wanted to know where her daughter Maria was. She demanded to speak to her husband, Jorge. She kept mentioning a house on a cliff overlooking the ocean, a house where she had apparently lived for decades. When doctors gently explained that she was Elena Russo, a painter from Florence, she became agitated. She insisted her name was Carmen Delgado and that she was from a small coastal town in Chile. She described her life in vivid detail, growing up poor in the 1940s, falling in love with a fisherman named Jorge, raising 5 children in a house built from reclaimed wood that looked out over the Pacific Ocean. Elena's husband was devastated. The woman he loved had been replaced by someone who didn't know him at all. But what happened next changed everything. Over the following months, researchers were able to investigate Elena's memories. They found the coastal town she described in Chile. They found records of a woman named Carmen Delgado who had lived there in the mid-20th century. And when they dug deeper, they discovered something that made the entire medical team go pale. Carmen Delgado had died in 1987, 16 years before Elena's aneurysm, at the age of 73. She had lived in a house on a cliff overlooking the ocean. She had been married to a fisherman named Jorge. She had 5 children, including a daughter named Maria. Every detail Elena remembered as Carmen was real. It was just that Carmen had been dead for over a decade. Neurologists had no explanation for how Elena could have memories of a woman she had never met, a woman who had died when Elena was only 26 years old and living on a different continent. There was no connection between them, no shared acquaintances, no evidence that Elena had ever been to Chile or heard of Carmen Delgado. Some researchers suggested that Elena might have encountered information about Carmen somewhere in her past, perhaps in a book or documentary, and her damaged brain had incorporated those details into a false identity. But this theory couldn't explain the emotional intensity of Elena's memories or the deeply personal details she recalled that had never been documented anywhere. Dr. Maria Fontana, the neurologist who oversaw Elena's case, later suggested that the experience pointed to something far stranger. If consciousness isn't generated by the brain, but merely filtered through it, then perhaps a severely damaged brain might accidentally tune into another consciousness entirely, even one that no longer exists in a living body. Eleanor eventually recovered most of her own memories, though it took years of therapy. But she never fully let go of Carmen. She still dreams of that house on the cliff sometimes, and she painted it once, from memory, a small wooden house overlooking an infinite blue ocean, a house she had never seen with her own eyes, but remembered perfectly. Number 3. The Professor Who Lived Backward. This case comes from Stanford University, and was documented by a team of cognitive scientists studying time perception disorders, and it remains one of the most intellectually challenging coma experiences ever recorded. In 2012, a philosophy professor named Dr. Robert Chen was jogging near his home in Palo Alto, California, when he suddenly collapsed from a massive stroke. By the time emergency responders reached him, he had been without oxygen for several minutes. He was placed on life support and remained in a coma for 16 days. When Robert woke up, his wife noticed something strange immediately. He seemed confused about the date, not just which day it was, but which year. He kept referring to events that hadn't happened yet, as if they were memories. Over the following weeks, as Robert recovered, he described an experience that made no logical sense. While unconscious, he had lived an entire lifetime, but instead of living it forward, from birth to death, he had lived it backward, from death to birth. Robert described dying first. He remembered being an old man, lying in a hospital bed much like the one he was currently in, surrounded by people whose faces were blurry but whose emotions he could feel clearly. He felt himself stop breathing. He felt his consciousness begin to fade. And then, instead of going dark, everything rewound. He experienced his life in reverse. He unlived his retirement, his children's graduations, his marriage. He unlived his career as a professor, his graduate studies, his undergraduate years. He unlived his childhood, his first day of school, his first words, and finally, he unlived his own birth, feeling himself folded back into darkness, into nothing. Then he woke up. The cognitive scientists who studied Robert's case were fascinated because his experience seemed to contradict everything we know about how the brain processes time. Memories are formed sequentially, encoded in the order they happen. To experience life backward would require the brain to somehow reverse its own fundamental architecture. But Robert insisted that his backward life hadn't felt strange while he was living it. Each moment had felt like the present. He hadn't been watching a movie played in reverse. He had been living each moment authentically, just in the wrong direction. Some researchers suggested that Robert's experience might support theories that time itself is more flexible than we perceive it to be. If consciousness isn't bound by the arrow of time in the same way physical matter is, then perhaps under certain conditions, a mind could move backward through its own experiences. Robert has spent the years since his stroke trying to understand what happened to him. He's written extensively about his experience and collaborated with physicists studying the nature of time. He believes his backward life wasn't just a dream or a hallucination. He believes it was a glimpse of something true about consciousness that science isn't equipped to explain yet. And sometimes, when he's falling asleep, he swears he can feel time moving in both directions at once. Number 2. The twins who shared the same coma dream. This case is perhaps the most compelling evidence that coma experiences might be more than just random neural activity, because it happened to two people at the same time. In 2016, twin sisters named Jessica and Jennifer Walsh were driving home from a concert in Sydney, Australia, when a drunk driver ran a red light and struck their car at high speed. Both sisters suffered severe head injuries and were rushed to the same hospital, where they were placed in adjacent rooms in the intensive care unit. Both slipped into comas. Jessica woke up first, after 9 days. Jennifer woke up 2 days later, and when doctors spoke to them separately, they discovered something that defied explanation. Both sisters described living the exact same life while unconscious. Not similar lives, the exact same life. They had both experienced being a woman named Alice who lived in rural England sometime in the 1800s. They both described the same farmhouse, the same husband, the same 3 children. They both remembered the same events in the same order: the wedding, the birth of each child, the harsh winters, the summer festivals in the village. And they both remembered the same death, dying of a fever at age 47, while Alice's youngest daughter held her hand. When doctors brought the sisters together and asked them to describe their experiences, they finished each other's sentences. They corrected each other on small details that the other had momentarily forgotten. They described the same landscape, the same faces, the same emotions, with perfect consistency. There was no way this could be coincidence. The sisters had been unconscious in separate rooms with no way to communicate. They hadn't spoken before describing their experiences, and yet they had apparently lived the exact same life as the exact same person in some kind of shared unconscious space. The neurologists who documented the Walsh sisters' case could find no physical explanation for what they had experienced. The twins had suffered different injuries to different parts of their brains. There was no neurological reason for them to have similar hallucinations, let alone identical ones. Some researchers suggested the sisters might have shared a genuine metaphysical experience, that their consciousnesses had somehow merged during the coma and traveled together to the same destination. If consciousness isn't strictly individual, if it can blend or connect under the right conditions, then perhaps the twins had temporarily become a single mind, experiencing a single life together. Jessica and Jennifer have struggled to return to normal life. They describe feeling like they lost a sister when Alice died, even though they both survived. They both dream of the farmhouse sometimes, and they both feel a strange grief for children who never existed, children they both remember holding, feeding, and loving for decades. The sisters now work together, documenting other cases of shared coma experiences, searching for anyone else who might have lived the same impossible life. And now, the case that haunts researchers more than any other. Number 1. The man who never came back. This final case is different from all the others because it didn't have a happy ending. There was no waking up. There was no returning to normal life. There was only a man trapped between 2 worlds, unable to fully exist in either one. In 2008, a 38-year-old engineer named David Park from Seoul, South Korea, was diagnosed with a rare brain tumor that required immediate surgery. The operation was complex and risky, and during the procedure, David's heart stopped twice. He was resuscitated both times, but the oxygen deprivation caused significant damage. He slipped into a deep coma that would last for 47 days. On day 48, David's eyes opened. His wife, who had kept vigil by his bedside for nearly 7 weeks, burst into tears of relief. She squeezed his hand and told him she loved him. But David just stared at her, not with recognition, not with confusion, with something closer to terror. Over the following days, David began speaking, but what he said made everyone around him deeply afraid. He kept asking where his other family was. David described waking up in the hospital and being confused, but not because of the surgery. He was confused because he had just died. In his mind, he was 91 years old. He had lived an entire life since the surgery, a life in which the tumor had been removed successfully, and he had gone on to live for another 53 years. He described watching his children, the children he hadn't had yet in 2008, grow up and have children of their own. He described retiring from engineering and spending his final years painting. He described his wife aging beside him, and he described holding her hand as she died at 84. He described his own death, peaceful and painless, surrounded by grandchildren he loved. And then he had woken up here in 2008, 47 days after his surgery, back in a body that was decades younger than it should be. But here's what made David's case so disturbing. He couldn't accept that his other life wasn't real. He couldn't process that his wife was still young, that his children hadn't been born, that the grandchildren he loved didn't exist. He kept trying to call people who weren't listed in any phone directory. He kept asking to visit places that had been destroyed or hadn't been built yet. He kept referring to historical events that hadn't happened. Doctors diagnosed him with severe dissociative disorder. They tried medications, therapy, everything they could think of, but David remained trapped between two realities, one he was physically living in and one he emotionally couldn't let go of. Within a year, David stopped eating. He stopped speaking. He would just stare at walls, occasionally murmuring names of people no one recognized. His wife, desperate to bring him back, played recordings of his favorite music, showed him photographs of their wedding, reminded him of memories they had shared. Nothing worked. David Park died in 2010, 2 years after waking from his coma. The official cause of death was failure to thrive, a medical term for when someone simply stops wanting to live. But everyone who knew his case believed the real cause was something else entirely. He had already lived his life. He had already experienced everything that mattered to him. And being sent back to the beginning, being told that all of it had never happened, was more than his consciousness could bear. Some researchers who studied David's case believe he represents the darkest possibility of coma consciousness. If the brain truly can generate entire lifetimes during unconsciousness, then waking up might not always feel like salvation. Sometimes it might feel like being torn away from everything you ever loved. And that raises a question that no one wants to ask. If you lived an entire life in a dream, loved people, raised children, grew old, and then woke up to find none of it was real, would you want to keep living? Or would the weight of that loss be too much to carry? David Park never found an answer. And maybe that's because there isn't one. Maybe some questions about consciousness and reality are simply too big for the human mind to process. What do you think? Are these experiences just random neural firings in dying and damaged brains? Or do they point to something fundamental about consciousness that modern science simply isn't ready to understand? Which case fascinated you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We're really excited to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. Thank you so much.